Great. My name is Håkan Hamer. I'm the Executive Director of the Nordic Society of Human Genetics and Precision Medicine. Thank you for joining us for another webinar. Before we get to our talks, I'll do a short, just a little mention of what we do at Nordic Society. We convene, and convening has been difficult recently, but we are now heading toward what we hope will be an in-person meeting in Helsinki in the fall. The exact dates haven't been determined yet, and we will hold a satellite workshop on COVID-19 Nordic research along with the Helsinki meeting. And so we all keep our fingers crossed that we will be there in person. And we work as different ways, engaging with Nordic research funders, universities, and policymakers. And in terms of information, we have a website where you can follow news of research and policy. And we send out a newsletter every few weeks, so we encourage you to join us. And we will be having webinars at least into the, I think maybe we'll aim for one more for June. April 14th, Ole Andreasen and Alexander Frey of the University of Oslo have a talk on psychiatric genetics. And I don't know exactly what Lily Milani will talk about in May, but stay tuned for that. And I'm going to leave it at that. And I'm going to stop my sharing and introduce our speakers for today. Paul Franks and Hugo Fitipaldi of Lund University. Paul is currently professor of genetic epidemiology at Lund University Diabetes Center in Malmö, Sweden, and an adjunct professor at the Harvard School of Public Health. And Hugo is a student in his group. And it's relatively new news, but Paul will also be moving to the Novo Nordisk Foundation very soon. He's given me permission to mention that, so we wish him well. And I think that's, we'll turn it over to Paul and Hugo at this point.
Smashing, thanks, Håkan. And thank you everyone for showing up, although of course we can't see how many people are there. So it's a bit of a strange forum that we've got used to in the Zoom/COVID times. So we are going to talk to you about what's been going on at a fairly meta level in human genetic research since the advent of genome-wide association studies in 2005. This is a little bit off our usual track, probably is for many in the audience, but hopefully you'll find some of this quite interesting. So Hugo is controlling the slides, which is why I've paused for a second. So just to remind everyone, there is, of course, more than a century of background to the evolution of genetics as we do it today in humans. But the sort of groundbreaking event in terms of human molecular genetics, of course, was the discovery of DNA back in 1953. And then later, the Human Genome Project and the ability to sequence the human genome, which was necessary to inform the design of microarray technologies that we call genome-wide arrays. And then from 2005, really the whole field of human genetics changed gear, and the approach has changed to be very agnostic and involving much larger scale international consortia than had ever really been done before I suspect in almost any area of biomedical research. So that really kicked off in 2005, and of course has been running very fast since then. So if we go to the next slide, Hugo. This is just a schematic from a paper from Peter Fisher and colleagues outlining the really sort of the development of GWAS over the last, from 2008 to 2015, and illustrating that a very large number of independent signals have been discovered and validated across all kinds of diseases, with the pace of that increasing as the sample size has increased with the continuing efforts of international consortia. And that has literally led to many thousands of GWAS publications across all different disease areas from 2005 onwards. So what we decided to do was essentially identify all of the published GWAS papers in the GWAS catalog for the top 9 major burdens of disease as published in the Lancet in 2019 on the global level. And you can see these here, and you can see the ontology references that are used to characterize each of those diseases. So this is the subject matter of the research that we'll talk about now, which is really mining the GWAS publications across all of these different disease areas from 2005 through 2020.
Yep. Sorry. All right. So with these papers in hand, with these disease traits in hand, we, as Paul said, we identified the disease, each GWAS paper and each disease area based on the ontology of it. And we use GWAS catalog to do that. So we pretty much based our samples information. We relied on the GWAS catalog and the catalog information about samples there. But in order to collect information about the co-authorship in each of these papers, we extract the raw XML files of each of these papers from PubMed. In total, we have around 1,700 papers, and we extract one XML file for each of these papers, which information of author's position and their affiliation. So we divided these co-authors. We start by dividing them in 3 different positions based on the list in each paper. So all authors represents all the authors that are listed in each paper. First authors are those that co-shared the first authorship of each paper, and that they are usually marked as co-authors in the first positions, and senior authors, those that share the last co-authorship, the last positions of co-authorship of the paper, so the senior co-authorship. And we start by doing the analysis to try to identify the country of affiliation of each author. So this was a big task, mainly because pretty much the PubMed only started to give this information of all the authors after 2014. So in order to do this, all these retrieving of affiliations, we had to assemble different tools, taxi mining tools, and we end up creating our own R package tool that uses taxi mining and natural language processing techniques to identify entities within each of these lines of raw text data of this affiliation. We also wanted to see the gender balance between the different positions of the co-authorship, and for this we relied on 2 different APIs. One is called Gender API, and the other one is Genderize.io. Both of them were extensively used in the literature to try to estimate the gender of of authors in scientific papers based on names, surnames, and country of origin. We end up also creating our package that in order to do that, but is yet not published. Later, we also did network analysis of these countries of affiliation, and we also extract income levels that is based on the classification of income made by World Bank, and we use the countries of affiliation to estimate these income levels of each of the authors. And in the samples, as I said, we use GWAS catalog, and we collect information from the countries of origin of these samples by the country of recruitment when the origin was not provided, and the ancestry of these samples. We also do network analysis on them, and we have also estimated income level based on the country of recruitment origin. So I'll start by showing some of the results. So we do have extensive amount of results. As you can imagine, we have, as I said, 1,700 papers across these different disease areas. And we also have 500,000 authors, different authors for these papers. So we do have a lot of results, and for the sake of time, it's impossible to show everything. So we select things that we think that is going to be interesting in the webinar today. So I'll start by showing our results regarding the ancestry of all the traits. And as you can see, not most, but all the papers use samples that have origins from European ancestry, right? So they have European ancestry. The second the second on the top of the ancestry is the East Asian ancestry for most of the traits. Only substance abuse has it with in the second position. And all the other ancestry are divided almost equally with shares that varies between 4 to 1% in each of these disease areas. So as you can see, most of the papers in all of these disease areas, they're pretty much use samples that come from European ancestry. With regards to the gender distributions of authors, I will first show you the overall results when we merge all the traits. So for the 1,700 traits that we are analyzing. For all authors positions, we have 66% of authors, of male authors, while only 34% of female authors. And as you can see, this is very similar in the other authorship positions for the first authors and for the senior authors as well. This, of course, varies across different disease areas. So I will pull 3 different disease trait areas just to show you different results that we have and some of the variations. So first, we have cardiovascular disease that represents pretty much what I just showed you. It has almost the same share in the 3 different positions, with the difference of the senior authorships being mostly more dominated by male authors. While we have some disease traits such as type 1 diabetes papers, where you can see that the senior balance it's actually tends to be more imbalanced. Actually, it goes through to the male authorship dominating almost 100% of the co-authorship in senior positions. While in chronic kidney disease, we have a 50-50, almost 50-50% share of males and females in the first authorship positions. Now you go to Paul, and we're going to show a little bit of our results regarding the countries of affiliation.
Yeah, so the next couple of sections are really just going to review how, to give you a sort of idea of how different countries have engaged in GWAS research as reflected by authorship on papers, and then at the end we'll then compare that with sort of data contributions. So this is simply showing for the top 20 countries. Obviously the list is much longer than this, but we decided not to clog the screen with all countries. But if you put all of the Nordic countries together, they rank 5th in terms of the occupation on all of the GWAS papers, which I think, considering the small size, relatively small size of Nordic countries, certainly illustrates a high level of engagement in the publications. And then if we look at the junior positions, the first authors, and these, as Hugo said, these are the authors who are starred first on the papers. Nordic countries also rank 5th, with the very large countries above, obviously, but still ahead of many of the what you would think were very advanced and larger scientific countries. And the same is true for senior authors. So obviously, this is looking, or that was looking at the Nordic countries as a whole, but just to give you a flavor of what it looks like. Between Nordic countries, you can see that perhaps unsurprisingly, Iceland, and this is now showing the time series data, Iceland certainly initially was very, very dominant in terms of authoring the GWAS papers, and that peaked at the beginning and is still pretty high. The only country that might be, we haven't put any statistics on these yet, but we will for the paper. But you know, Sweden looks like it might be going up a bit, but most countries, certainly Estonia and Norway, are pretty much plateaued. And those pictures are, sorry, go back, Hugo. And those pictures are essentially the same. Tells the same story for junior and senior authorship. Okay, next slide. This is now just quickly showing across the major countries, the top ranking countries, what's happening over time. China, it's a little hard to see from the scale, but China is increasing its dominance in terms of engagement in GWAS papers, whereas the US has really reduced its dominance over time to some degree, and perhaps also the UK. And this is you know, a similar story for first authors and senior authors. So now across those different diseases that we've assessed, of course, the Nordic countries do better in some disease areas than in others. The disease area where we've probably, you know, at least engaged least in GWAS, but still rank high, is for skin disease. This is for all authors. And the same is essentially true for the other first and senior author positions, ranking either 6th or 7th there. So that's the lowest ranking disease area from the Nordic countries. But if we go to neurological disorders, you'll see that the Nordic countries rank 3rd, which again, considering the size of those countries, is pretty impressive, I think. So certainly played a significant role in the GWASs of neurological disorders, both in terms of leadership of those papers and overall engagement. Okay, so now, Hugo, are you going to take this? I forget.
Yeah, sure. I can take this.
Yeah.
So we did a similar thing, as we said, for the samples, right? So the countries of the recruitment, and we, as you can see, we have like similar, but at the same point, we have the Nordic countries actually going on top on the list when we use all traitors to see where these data come from. So where the samples come from. So the Nordic countries have a good share. When we analyze all authors of ranking 2nd and the most contribution, and while the US is the top 1 in countries of affiliation, here it's the top 3 and is the 3rd, and the UK figures the 1st position. And as we did something similar. So with what Paul just showed to you. So we also look in these disease areas, which of the disease traits the Nordic ones contributes less with data, and skin disease was also the disease area where the Nordic countries contributed less with samples. While when we go to cancer, the Nordic countries together are actually the top one in sample contributions.
So just for a little bit of fun, and you can decide for yourself what this really means. But this is looking at the ratio of the percentage occupation of coal authorionships over the percentage of the data contribution per country. And I'll start with the UK, which has the least co-authorship per unit data contribution, and that's largely because of UK Biobank. The US, on the other hand, in China, they do very well in terms of both junior and senior and total co-authorships on papers relative to the amount of data that's actually coming from those countries. And as you can see, the Nordic countries don't do very well at all if you think that the data contribution should in some way, shape or form be mirrored by co-authorships on papers. Now, this may well be because the Nordic countries obviously have excellent biobanks historically, and therefore has been a gold mine for data for many GWAS experiments. And perhaps, certainly in the early days, there were a lot of transatlantic collaborations that meant that that samples went overseas, and data analysts who wrote papers perhaps got more of the co-authorship credit for that. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that with UK Biobank, a lot of scientists that don't have access to great data tend to work with large cohorts like UK Biobank, and that may be true for the particularly for scientists, data analysts in China. Okay, and this now just is another way of looking across different disease areas, which is to say that, this red dot shows the ranking for sample contributions, the whole pool of data that's been used in GWAS in each of these different disease areas. And you can see that, for cancer, the Nordic countries rank first. We've already told you that, and we rank high in terms of data contributions across all disease areas, the lowest being skin disease. And almost always the ranking for co-authorship positions is less than the ranking for data contributions, and occasionally it's the same. But never do we beat the ranking for data contributions. So the story is that across all disease areas, the Nordic countries have contributed an awful lot to GWAS in terms of data, and have, generally speaking, led to a lesser extent. There is one exception, which is senior authorship for substance abuse. Anyway, these are just a bit of fun to put things in context. So to summarize then, the majority of GWAS work has been performed in participants of European ancestry, with a smaller but still large proportion of people from East Asia, and other ethnicities are generally poorly represented. The exception to that is chronic kidney disease, where people of African American ancestry have been a fairly large subgroup in GWAS analysis, but generally speaking, otherwise they're not. GWAS papers for most disease areas are dominated by male scientists at all levels, regardless of whether it's first, last, or total authorship. Although in some disease areas, such as CKD, it's more balanced. And so whatever that means, but some areas tend to appear to engage more scientists who are females than others. Without doubt, Nordic scientists rank very high in terms of their engagement in GWAS research, and data from Nordic countries has made a huge contribution to the corpus of GWAS research that's been performed over the last 15 years. But I will go out on the limb here and say I'm not sure that Nordic scientists have necessarily led the work to the extent that perhaps they could have, given the data contributions, which is really a strong argument for why the Nordic countries should be, as Kari would say, turning their backs together and working together to try to make sure that we don't just manage the data that we have in the Nordic countries, but also lead the analysis and reporting of those data. And that is what we wanted to tell you today.
think we'll bring the panel back in if we could. If Kari and group in Iceland, and Ruth, are you there? There you are. And so I will. We'll go ahead and go with the panel right now and ask for some initial responses. And I'll do a quick introduction. Ruth Luce is at Mount Sinai, Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And I believe you're still actually there, but you were moving to Copenhagen sometime in the next month. Is that correct?
Coincidentally, I'm in Copenhagen just to do some paperwork, but officially still in New York. And in April 15th, I start in Copenhagen officially.
Okay. And in Iceland, Kari Stefansson, Barney Haldorsson, Daniel Gudbjartsson, and Patrick Sulem are standing by. And I think, Kari, would you like to have the first crack at Paul?
Yeah, it is interesting. It is interesting, and it is complicated to figure out what constitutes a contribution to this kind of science. But it is clear, it is obvious that a lot of this imbalance when it comes to use of data has to do with the way in which science has been funded in the various countries. Because there is absolutely boundless talent in the Nordic countries to do the kind of work that has been published in these Genome Association studies. So I think that one of the major reasons that so large part of all of this went to America, it has to do with better funding of science there, which probably is not, the imbalance there is probably not quite as large now as it used to be 10 years ago or 50 years ago. But there is still imbalance when it comes to it. It's also because the Nordic countries are relatively small, the nations are relatively small, and it has been more difficult to organize cross borders than it is to organize within large townships in the United States or within the United States in general. So I think that one of the ways in which we could ensure that we contribute more to the discoveries coming out of the resources, the population resources we have, would be to make it easier for us to organize into larger units that work together. Because let's face it, the minimal size of a unit to make a meaningful contribution in science like this is fairly large. And one of the goals of the Nordic Society of Human Genetics and Precision Medicine was to try to facilitate a collaboration across countries, bring together larger groups of people. And I don't think that we can claim yet that we have succeeded in it. I think that we are inching in the direction of making it easier, but still the collaboration between scientists and the various Nordic countries are at a relatively superficial level. You know, we are still working like independent groups that, you know, join together to replicate for each other, etc. And I think it would be desirable to, if we could succeed in putting together projects that we organize from the beginning, that we execute together. And you know, the big dream is to put together a Nordic biobank equivalent to the British Biobank, or something equivalent, better yet, to our Future of Health, which is sort of an emergent new initiative in Great Britain. But you know, I think that yes, we haven't contributed as much to the data analysis, not as much as we would have liked to. we haven't gotten the credit we believe we should have gotten for the utilization of this material, but we have no one else to blame except for ourselves, right? We have been lazy, we have not been focused, we have not been organized, and we have a lot of reason. We have not the possibility of doing this better in the near future is much greater than it has ever been before. And I think it's important to have this analysis, this data in one place. And I just would like to thank Paul and Hugo for having done this. Håkon?
Hugo, if you could turn off the slide share, that would be good. Then we could see everybody a bit bigger. Oh, there we go. Paul, did Hugo want to respond, or Ruth, would you like to weigh in then?
Yeah, I was actually pleasantly surprised that the sex distribution of first authors is very similar with the last authors. Typically, I would expect proportionally more women as first authors and fewer as last authors, just as a reflection of sort of academic, the sex distribution in academic sort of levels. I wonder, did you do some sort of a comparison with other life science papers? Do you see similar sex distributions, or is that like too far out?
So sorry, Paul, if you want to say something. All right. So first, yes, when we start doing this project, this is a long project that started a couple of years ago, and as data was being introduced, that time was coming. And for some of the disease areas, we were seeing exactly what you just described. That is like in the first positions, there were more like as a share of percentages of male and female equal share, while in the senior positions was mainly dominated by male investigators. But with time, we start to see that these, for many of the traits that we analyze, it start to shift and to shape a little bit more of the almost equal contribution, which is good and interesting to observe while we're doing the studies. But we did think about comparing this with different disease areas. There are a lot of studies in the literature that shows already these different areas and how the authors are compatible. The thing is, one of the things that I believe it's unique in our study is that this is one of the first studies that we actually look for a long list of authors. So which also makes our work a little bit more difficult, because we have tons of data to analyze. So our methodology also grew while we were developing these two. So we end up deciding to stay with the GWAS areas, just because all of the papers were already, like, there are papers already that were published in these different areas, but also because of the amount of data that we would have to outgrow to analyze as well.
Rose, it's interesting. I was just reminded of this today, that when I was in medical school, only 3% of the students were females. Today at the medical school at the University of Iceland, 67% of the students are females. So there has been, in my lifetime, enormous change for the better. All right. And I'm actually surprised, however, to see how much the progress women have made within our field of science. I think it is remarkable.
Within the 15 years, do you see a change in the sex ratio?
So I'm going to, I mean, Hugo's probably got the exact data in his head, but so certainly when we were looking earlier on, because we started with earlier data, it was quite imbalanced. So you'd have many more, relatively speaking, junior females authors than seniors. And it's interesting because 15 years is a reasonably long time in somebody's career path. That does seem to have shifted over time, right, Hugo? So which tells you two things. So one is that there's more gender equality, you can say, but the other is that we're actually bringing junior scientists through to the senior level, regardless of whether they're men or women. It tends to suggest that, right? Because if the ratio was higher early on, then you would expect the ratio to change over time, become higher later. So I think that actually the GWAS community should be proud that it's affected this change, that's nurtured junior authors, and it's redressed the gender imbalances that exist, pretty much everywhere, right? So so I think that's actually pretty good news.
Yeah, I have one more comment. I think the contribution of sample size. I think the difference between authorship or affiliation and sample size is probably even starker when you express sample size per country size, or how many people there are.
It's a good point. We did, I mean, I've shown some of these data a year ago or so, and there was a point where I calculated, I forget what the, the Nordic countries represent in terms of the global population, and it's whatever, less than 1% or something. And yet the data contribution is, north of 20-something%, right? So as a, when you look at it that way, the Nordic countries have had a huge impact, and that that does raise questions around whether what we infer, particularly from rare variant studies, are skewed towards the Nordic genomes. Certainly it's skewed towards European genomes, but even amongst the European data, a lot of that data is actually Nordic data. So that's maybe a good segue into one of the other questions that is sitting in my chat window right now. But I'm curious to know what you and Kari and others at Decode think about the influence that such heavy emphasis on European and Nordic genomes might have on genetic discovery, and whether that matters.
Personally, I would favor more non-European GWASs for new discoveries.
No, I am absolutely convinced that the new wave of discovery is gonna come out of sequencing African genomes. I think that when it comes to these rare variants, we are going to get much more interesting stuff out of the African genome. Our European genomes have been mined so thoroughly and have become rather uninteresting of late.
We haven't given Bjarni or Patrick or Daniel a chance at the floor. Would any of you like to jump in on that?
So one thing we know is that the discovery, wherever they are done, they will probably have translation for all the groups. And so we were talking just now about the African. One thing we know about rare disease, for example, is if you take the example of PCSK9, it happens that the place where you have the most common loss of function are in African. About 2 or 3% of African are heterozygote for loss of function in PCSK9. But the drugs have been developed, and it's for all ethnicities. So wherever the findings will be done, it's very likely that they will impact all of the populations. So it's probably not going to be like population-specific type of science. It probably will benefit everybody. Do you understand what I mean, Kari?
Yeah, what you're basically telling us is that we are one and the same species.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that is not particularly profound or interesting, all right. We are talking in terms of where are we likely to make discoveries.
Yes.
And we have so vastly different diversity in the African genome than we have in the European genome. And we have been mining this bloody European genome, these these genomes that make people who look like bird shit, all right? It is about time that we begin to branch out into the African, the Asian, and actually the Hispanic, South African genomes. We have to do it. I think it is very reasonable to begin to shift the major emphasis there. But there are so many things left to be done in the European genome. Just think about it. When Patrick took a look at the Icelandic genomes that have been sequenced, 65,000 whole Icelandic genomes, he begins to look, because he has been managing diagnostic sequencing for the National Hospital of Iceland. We've been doing pro bono whole genome sequencing for diagnostic purposes. He finds that about 5–6% of these genomes contain tier 1 or tier 2 mutations as defined by the American College of Clinical Geneticists. So even these dramatic mutations that lead to sort of actionable problem are much more common than we thought before. And we need to begin to mine these genomes or these data for clinical purposes, not simply for the diagnostic purposes, no, for the discovery purposes. So there are a lot of interesting things that we can still fish out of these genomes. But when it comes to the low-hanging fruits in discovery, they've all been picked.
Could I ask the non-scientist question, and maybe there are a few graduate students who will appreciate that I asked it, but going from from Europeans to someone else in our own species, what does that gain us, Kauri? What is it specifically that you gain by going from one population to another in terms of finding causes of disease?
You see, the nature of discovery is such that if you can predict what it is, it's not going to be discovery. All right. So I cannot tell you what it is that we're going to discover. I can simply tell you that we are going to be mining and sequencing genomes that look vastly different, that have greater diversity, sequence diversity. And when we are in a position to match that with phenotypes, it's going to help us to find all kinds of things. It's going to help us to find, rare sequence variants that associate with common diseases. It's going to allow us to bridge between rare diseases and common diseases and do all kinds of stuff. And then we're going to come back 2 years from now and you're going to point out that I'm wrong. And that's quite fine. I have no problems with that. I think, however, when you're assessing, where should we invest our effort next, I think most people would agree that we should do it in the African genome. And I think it's going to be, I predict it's going to lead to spectacular tidal variable discoveries.
Can I ask a question related to that? So,
the answering questions, Paul.
Well, we're not the experts in the room, so it relates to this issue of whether it's a politically charged question about whether just because a country contributes lots of data, it should also get co-authorship credit, right? I mean, they're not entirely connected things, but I can certainly see that, on the one hand, you could argue that Nordic countries may be a little bit hard done by, and maybe that's their own fault. When you talk about African genomes, I wonder to what extent African scientists will be involved in the discovery work and how much of it will just be outsourced outside Africa, and whether there is a need for any kind of emphasis on developing the education and training in population genetics in Africa to try to make sure that side of it is also nurtured as well as the discovery.
There's only so much you can do there, but I can tell you, we are trying to establish a collaboration with an institution in the United States that is managing healthcare of people of African descent. And one of the things that we are trying to do is to make sure that out of it will come to collaboration, not just them sending biological samples to Iceland, but that we work together to plan it, execute on it, mine the data together. And there's only so much you can do there because the goal is to do science, all right? We are not gonna impose racial equality in the United States through a genetics project, but we can at least make sure that we give everyone a chance and opportunity and encouragement to participate to the extent that they can.
I'm sure there's plenty more talent and capabilities to be found among African Americans than in tiny Iceland. So I don't think it will be a problem.
What you're saying is that we are few and stupid, so it's going to be easy for us to find more talented scientists, Black African American scientists in America, and I agree with that. And some of these stupid scientists are sitting in this room, so I shouldn't have.
I think for H3 Africa, it was a requirement from the funding agency, I think the Wellcome Trust, that you would provide some training within Africa and the local people should be involved. But I don't know how that all worked out. But I can tell you, I'm in the US, I'm involved in the PAGE consortium, which is specifically focused to study non-European ancestry populations. And the vast majority of the researchers are of European ancestry.
Yeah, that was always, you know, we have been looking around for an opportunity to work with discovery in African American cohort. And to begin with, we were negotiating with a large institution that was supposed to work with us on recruitment. And all of the individuals we were talking to were middle-aged white men. So we all of a sudden realized that we were backing up the wrong tree. So we changed our tactic and went to talk to one of these historically Black medical colleges.
I have a question that came in. It's this question of why Nordic scientists receive relatively little credit in disease areas where they've contributed large amounts of money. Is it more a function of that we're good at sharing data than that we're not doing the research ourselves? Is that a contributor?
No, it was mostly that the infrastructure was not in place. Funding mechanisms weren't there. It is getting better. It's getting substantially better. And, you know, now, for example, Denmark has one of the largest funds in the world that funds, you know, biomedical research. So that is having an impact. And, but it was mostly a question of resources, I think, question of tradition and collaboration. Just the GWAS era has brought us closer to each other. We are becoming more used to working with each other. If you make a tentative discovery in Iceland, we can find someone in another Nordic country very quickly to work on replicating for us, etc. So we have become more accustomed at working together. And so I think that our contribution when it comes to the utilization of our population resources will be much greater in the future than it has been so far. But we can do still better.
And I think it may be because of the long history that Nordic countries have in building biobanks, that you know, resources have been clearly put into that, and there is only so much in terms of resource that's available. And so I think it has taken a lot of sort of lobbying to maybe adjust a little bit the way in which money is invested in the different countries. I came to Sweden in 2006, just as GWAS was starting, and started working with the Northern Sweden Biobank. And I literally could not get GWAS done or metabochip typing done in Sweden. I tried, I couldn't get it done, and so it got done at the Sanger in the end. But that was a problem then. But now, of course, we have SciLife, we have National Genome Center. Things have changed a lot. So I think we're definitely in a much better position in most Nordic countries than we were at the beginning of the GWAS era. So it's certainly going in the right direction.
Maybe part of it is also like indeed good at sharing, because your biobanks have a lot of phenotypes. So you invest once in a genome typing, and you can contribute to a lot of consortium.
Yeah. But we have actually, Ruth, in the Nordic countries, we have been much better at generating healthcare registries than biobanks. So I don't think that we have have the right to jump or chest over the development of biobanks, but the healthcare registries. And because we have our personal identifier that goes into all records that have to do with us, once you have genotyped someone or sequenced someone, you have an opportunity to use that person in incredibly large number of processes. And that has been basically our approach at Decode. We started that in '96, that we were focused on making sure that we would only genotype and then sequence people whom we could look at from birth to death, basically, looked at every aspect. And there's no data point that has not been used both as a case and as a control in many studies. So this population approach to the science has been easier in the Nordic countries, or at least in Iceland, and I think anywhere else in the world.
And this becomes very difficult in these countries that don't have a good healthcare system.
And no identifiers.
And no identifiers, and also if they have, you know, different healthcare systems, and where in the Nordic countries it's usually a single system.
Yeah, and in countries that with great regularity elect Casey men as the president.
Ruth, you've clearly moved to the Nordic region for the better weather, but when you look as an outsider and you're coming in, do you see any untapped opportunities or any things that you could suggest might be preventing the Nordics from doing the work, getting the credit, etc.?
Right. I was not prepared for that question, but I think the focus these days is at least in my field, because I'm focusing on obesity and BMI, and we are now doing a meta-analysis with 4 million. I don't know what there still can be done, at least when it comes to BMI, but untapped areas is more refined phenotypes. And I think also the translation from locus to function. And I think at least from what I know in Denmark, there's a lot of work going into that direction as well.
That's one of the big opportunities for you in Copenhagen, is look at progression of disease. You know, what some of the biggest unmet needs when it comes to studies that we are doing is have cohorts where there is a longitudinal documentation of progression of disease. Because it has become obvious with at least some diseases that what leads to initiation of disease is biologically distinct from what leads to the progression.
Mm-hmm.
So where in Copenhagen are you going to be working?
At the Center for Basic Metabolic Research.
Mm-hmm.
I have a comment here from Tanya Stocks, who says, thanks for a great study, which may also apply to other fields, such as register-based studies. Why so little credit? I would guess lack of funding, as already mentioned, lack of paid positions, leading to a lot of time spent on getting funding for your own salary for many years. And this, perhaps also culture, potentially leading to aiming for many publications rather than few more time-consuming and high-risk publications. And then there's a question mark at the end of that statement. So maybe you'd like to answer or address that.
I mean, my guess is that the situation isn't much more stable in the US than it is in the Nordic countries in terms of positions and the pressure to publish and those kind of things. So I think there are relatively rare exceptions in some in the UK, for example, at MRC units. They sometimes have, you know, as Ruth and I know, because that's where we go back to in Cambridge, there's more stable positions. But I think that the instability of academic appointments is fairly ubiquitous. But I do think it comes down to another issue which Kari touched on earlier, which is that you need big machines to put everything together to really generate the really high profile papers on, you know, and to do that over and over again. I think we haven't had that kind of coordination. I think DECO clearly has had it, but most other centres in the Nordic countries haven't had that kind of coordination and muscle and drive. Not, aside from any individual level of job stability, it's more of a collective thing, and that's clearly, I think, what we need to do next to level up a bit.
Any last thoughts on rectification of these issues? Some of the gender questions, for example.
One of the things we noticed, we look similar to what you have done, Hugo. We look at the gender of first daughter, or we looked at the patronym. In Iceland, it's quite specific. If it says daughter, it will say dottir. If it's a son, it will say son. So we were just looking. And one thing we noticed is the fraction of first daughter that are women increased substantially through the years. So now there are probably more first daughters that are women, but 10 years ago it was the opposite.
But then you see,
Yeah,
because it's a complicated stuff. What the, are you aiming for? Is it the goal in and of itself to have the same percentage of authors, women as men or men as women, or is that a goal in and of itself in all aspects of society? It's not entirely clear to me. I think, however, I'm taking a risk by making the statement, but it is interesting that men and women, they approach science in a little bit different way. And I think it's extraordinarily important to make sure that the diversity that lies in that is being used in science. Not to try to have women work in exactly the same way as men in science, or men exactly the same way as women, making sure that we take advantage of the diversity that lies in the differences between the sexes. When it comes to this idea of many or few papers, I think people should be paid good money for publishing few papers rather than many. I think that we are all of us publishing too many papers. Literature is heavily contaminated by sort of subpar publication from people like me.
But I think, Kari, the problem is that the sort of performance indicators are set up in a way that if you figure out how to work within the system that we have, then it publishing a lot tends to matter. And so you're right that it probably isn't good for science and society, but that is how the system is kind of set up. So maybe it needs to be changed.
A few decades ago, there was a system in place at the University of Iceland. They did not even count the publications they did pay them. This is an interesting way, and why is it more reasonable to count the papers than to weigh them? It's not sure.
We have another.
The papers would be too long if you're going to weigh.
We have another comment in the way of a question. Doesn't oversharing the same data set, quote unquote, also require raising threshold of discoveries to avoid false ones? For example, GWAS associations discovered just by chance.
I think this is about the time when we call this meeting to a halt. Right?
We are just at the 4 o'clock hour.
Yes, so I think Håkon, that this is good enough.
Paul right. And Hugo, thank you so much for being here, and everyone else.
Thank you all, Kari and other decoders, Ruth, Håkon, organizing this. Thank you very much. It's been good.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.